I cannot say that I have ever truly been physically hungry above and beyond the occasional missed meal or the infrequent diet I might undertake because I've been eating too much. So I have no inkling what that kind of hunger many people in this world experience, what that means, where a shortage of food means they cannot eat enough to sustain themselves or their families. I have no idea of the desperation of those who do not know where their next meal will be coming from. And truth be told, I'm always astounded to learn that people do go hungry, even in our communities where food abounds. According to the USDA's report, the latest report in 2020, 38 million Americans in the United States experienced hunger. And that includes over 13 million children. I know one of the shocking images that kind of haunts me from this past year, where I don't know if you remember seeing this, the pictures, I was so surprised by this, the pictures of cars lined up for hours waiting to drive through the food pantry, trying to find meals for their households. And I've always thought there's something wrong about this picture these days, where people often must choose between paying rent or paying medical bills or paying for medicine, and whether they can pay for enough food for themselves and their children. And that kind of hunger probably is alien to almost every single person in the pew here today. It is alien to most of us, who often have enough as a people and as a church. And we often can respond out of the abundance we have, especially when we hear those words, "I was hungry and you fed me." And we have. We support various agencies, food banks. We serve meals at the homeless shelter. We send essential goods and services, seeds and fertilizers to our brothers and sisters in El Salvador. That's a good thing, truth be told, an easy thing for us to do, giving out of the abundance we probably take for granted. I was hungry and you fed me. But I would posit to you this morning that there is a different, and I would even say a deeper kind of hunger gnawing in every single one of us these days. And I would posit to you this morning and propose to you that every single one of us here in the sanctuary are truly, deeply hungry. The miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 seems straightforward enough. There are hungry people in a remote area. The disciples encourage Jesus to send the people on their way to forage for themselves to local villages. And Jesus responds by telling the disciples, "You give them something to eat." And aghast, they point out, "Well, we have 5 loaves and 2 fish." And Jesus says, "Well, tell them to sit down in smaller groups," and after he breaks the bread and he gives thanks to God, he gives it to them, and they distribute it among the groups. And there is such abundance that there are 12 baskets full of broken pieces. And I love the line that they all ate and were satisfied. Most of us know that story from Sunday school, have heard a number of sermons on it. It's one of the many miracles we cite for Jesus. And miracles, we should understand, for Jesus were always more than the act itself. The miracles for Jesus, whenever people would talk about the miracles he did, he would always point not to what he did, but to the ways in which miracles are signs and symbols of God's kingdom. And whether the miracle was a healing or a casting out of demons, or whether the miracle was stilling storms, or the miracle was raising the dead, or whether the miracle was feeding 5,000, the miracle itself was not important to Jesus. It was a metaphor for an experience of God's presence in the world. The miracle, Jesus says, represents God's activity in and among us, and the miracle asks us to see the world a little bit differently. And so I say, I think we are, every single one of us, deeply and profoundly hungry. We are hungry for God. Now, we might frame it in this way. We might say we're hungry these days for connection in the midst of our loneliness. We might describe ourselves as hungry for hope in the midst of despair. We are hungry for unity in times of discord. We are hungry for justice in these spaces of inequity. We are hungry for healing in a time of such woundedness. We are hungry for life in the day of COVID. We are, all of us, hungry these days, even if we cannot really name what it is we yearn and hunger for. Now, one of the earliest church theologians, Augustine, about 2,000 years ago, described this hunger in this way. He wrote, "Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in thee." And I agree. All of us these days are restless and hungry for God. And we are so like those disciples in the story, saying, "Jesus, these people are hungry, and we don't have enough to feed them." And I must confess, it feels like that these days at times. That I think we're struggling as a church, as disciples, how to be the church and how to be disciples amidst the challenges we face. In many ways, the very normal things we do to feed the hungry, it's been difficult to bring people together safely in our normal ways of being church, whether that is through our public worship or programming during the week. That the very normal ways we feed people seem too little to feed, and that there's a pervasive hunger that surrounds us all. You see, we're like those disciples, we the church and disciples ourselves. Lord, all we got, these 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? It's all we got. And yet Jesus tells us, just as he told them, you give them something to eat. And the good news is that God takes, through Jesus Christ, takes those 5 loaves and 2 fish and blesses them and thanks God, and it's enough. More than enough. 12 baskets full of broken pieces, and the hungry are fed. To be honest, I'm not sure how the miracle works, but I believe God uses our 5 loaves and 2 fish and feeds those who hunger through us and within us. Jesus gives thanks to God for that 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed so many. And I've often wondered that really the miracle in the story is not that Jesus made it multiplied or did some kind of magic hocus pocus and and made more bread and more fish. But maybe the miracle is that Jesus called them to sit down in these groups, and they found it within themselves to share what they had. That they found it within themselves to love and care for each other. Maybe the true miracle, as Hannah kind of pointed out, is that people produced the loaves and fishes that fed the hungry. And the challenge for us is, do we really believe that God in us can feed this world so hungry for connection and for God? And how do we do that? We ourselves struggle and hunger for God in connection. One of my favorite novels of all time is a novel written by Alice Walker called The Color of Purple. Many of you may have read the book yourself or seen the movie. And it tells this rather startling and stark story of a young African-American woman named Celie, who was living in the rural South in the early part of the 20th century, living amidst and suffering and experiencing the oppression of racism, the Jim Crow laws, but also experiencing abuse, trauma at the hands of her father and her husband. And she hungers for something more. And then she meets a woman named Shug Avery, a free-spirited singer, that shows her a different way, that feeds her soul. And her life begins to change, and she is fed. And I'll share a brief passage from this novel, probably one of my favorite passages in a book of any kind. And it's Shug and Celie standing in the field of purple flowers. And Shug turns to Celie and she says to her, "I think it pisses God off if you walk by the color purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it." "What'd it do when it pissed off?" I asked, Celie said. "Oh, it makes something else. People think pleasing God is all God care about. But any fool living in the world can see it's always trying to please us back." "Yeah, I say," Celie says. "Yeah," Shug says. "It's always making little surprises and springing them on us when us least expect." Celie says, "You mean it want to be loved just like the Bible say?" And Shug says, "Yes, Celie, everything want to be loved." Just as Jesus took that bread, that small offering of 5 loaves and 2 fish, and turned to God and said, "Thank you for this 5 loaves and 2 fish." We are called to take the parts of ourselves, to thank God for the gifts that surround us every day that we don't pay attention to, that ticks God off because we can't even admire or give thanks for the color purple. And it is in that way, in the midst of God's grace and the reception of those gifts, that we truly, truly are fed. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.